Well, it's great to be back together after our Easter celebration last week. It was a good time, right? Those of you who were here, we had a good time together celebrating the resurrection. And because of that, because of Easter, we have been a few weeks out of our normal sermon series, which has been in the book of Acts. So most of, if you haven't been around or if you've been a newcomer, most of the winter and the spring here, we've been in the book of Acts, which is the fifth book in the New Testament, the first book right after the gospel. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then this book of Acts, it kind of tells about the expansion of the early church. And what we've been looking at is what is genuine Christianity really? Like, what is authentic Christianity really look like? And this is the place to look as the early church expands. We're looking at how did this improbable little band of Christ followers begin to explode the gospel out across the known world whereas today we have Christianity as the largest and fastest growing movement in the world. How did these things happen? And so I just want to, as we kind of get back into Acts, I just want to push reset kind of on the deal and look at where have we kind of been. And so to do that, we need to kind of go like, wide angle lens, and then we'll zoom in on chapter 14. But we need to do that because it's kind of confusing, because a lot of people will say, you know what, the church starts in the book of Acts. But that's not really true. The church doesn't start in Acts. The church starts with God. The church is the fruition of God's vision. The Acts is actually the fruition of God's vision from the beginning of eternity. In fact, you can find that vision on the very first page of the Bible, because what is the church? The church is not this building. The church are the people, right? The church is the people of God spreading the glory of God. That's what the church is. God's people spreading God's glory. So you don't just come to church. We need to be the church. The church is the people. So this was God's vision from the very beginning. Go to Genesis 1 and see, what does God say? He said, let us make mankind, in our own image, after our likeness. What does that mean? That means a million things, but generally it means that God is stamping on human beings His own likeness, that we would bear His creativity, His relational capacity, His joy, His beauty, His truth, His grace, His love, and that would be marked, that would be stamped, that likeness would be stamped on people. And then what was His vision to do with that? Verse 28, He says, I commanded them to be fruitful, multiply, and what? Fill the earth. So you see the vision, be fruitful, multiply is not just about sex. It is about sex, but He's saying, I've given you my image, and now fill the earth with my image. I've given you, fill the earth with my truth, love, beauty, glory, and grace. It's God's people spreading God's glory. And so you can say, well, that got all messed up with Adam and Eve and sin, and the world's broken now and that kind of stuff, right? Well, thank goodness our issues, problems, rebellions, whatever, don't jack up the plan of God, because the church, again, is not plan B, C, D. The church was always God's plan A. It was from the beginning. So you look at, Genesis 12, verse 3. He calls Abraham and says the same thing to him. See, what does He say in verse 3? In chapter 12, verse 3, He says, in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. What does that mean? It means all the nations of the earth, all the ethnicities, all the cultures, every tribe, tongue, language, and nation will be blessed. The church is the people of God spreading the glory of God. The book of Acts is His vision, the fruition of His vision from the beginning. You get the Gospels, Matthew 16, Jesus promises, right? He says what? I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it. Nothing will stop the coming and growing and spreading my church. And then we get to our book, so we're starting to zoom in a little more here. Acts chapter 1, verse 8, which is, we've said many times, kind of the key verse of Acts. If you want to know what the book is about, if you want to be able to outline it, know the flow and everything, this verse tells you what the whole book is about. So this is Jesus' final word to His disciples before His ascension. He says, but you will receive power when the Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses. Where? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. See, God promised, Jesus promised, and now the Spirit is delivering. In the book of Acts, we're seeing this vision fruition come. So here's how the book of Acts is outlined. You can see this on this map. So you'll be my witnesses where first? In Jerusalem, right? So this little red dot, Acts chapter 1 to 7, that's where we are. Gospel comes to Jerusalem. It's in that city. Then you'll be my witnesses Jerusalem, and then where? Judea and Samaria, right? boom, chapters 8 through 12 of Acts, here we are. It's expanding across that eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And then, after Judea and Samaria, where will you be my witnesses? To the ends of the earth. And so by Acts chapter 13 to 28, the whole second half of the book is the gospel spreading across the known world at that time, the whole Greco-Roman world, which brings us closer to our passage now. So chapter 13, a couple weeks ago, was the beginning of that movement to the ends of the earth. It was Paul and Barnabas sent out on a missionary journey. 1,600 miles they go. And here's what a missionary journey is and what they did. They go city to city. They preach the gospel, they do good works, they evangelize, and they establish churches. Chapter 13 is the first half of that journey. Chapter 14, our text today, is the second half of the journey, specifically focused on their time in one city called Lystra. Here's what's unique about chapter 14. Here's the difference. Chapter 14 is the first time that the gospel comes into a completely pagan culture, a culture that has no connection to the Christianity. They don't know who Jesus is. They don't know the Jewish scriptures. They don't know the Old Testament. They have no idea about this. And the question is, how was the early church so successful and so effective at bringing the gospel to places that have never experienced it or heard it before? What was their posture toward the world? What was their posture toward people who didn't look like them, think like them, act like them, vote like them, whatever? What was their posture towards that? And it's an important question because our culture today is becoming more and more post-Christian, right? Where people do not identify or connect in any way, really, to the Christian story, to this guy, Jesus, and we don't really know who he is. They might have some vague idea, but we're becoming more and more like that. And the question is, what should our posture toward the world look like? How do we keep our edge as a church? Because as a church gets older, what do you start to do? You start to become more institutionalized, you start to be more inner-focused, you start to get more religious, and we want to keep that from happening. We want to keep our edge as a church and think about what is our posture toward the world. That's what Paul's going to show us here. So the first posture we should have, and I'm going to set these up as kind of dichotomies, is helping the hurting rather than slamming the sinners. Helping the hurting rather than slamming the sinners. So we begin in verse 8, and Paul is in this city, chapter 14, verse 8, of Lystra. He's on the missionary journey, 1,600 miles, right there in this little city called Lystra, and he's teaching and he's preaching for the very first time the gospel in this area, in this neighborhood. Now, what should he do? How should he approach it? There's a lot of people in our culture today that say, you know what, we got to get really hard on the world. Like, we've got to tell them they're living wrong, they're going to hell, you're doing wrong, you're living wrong, whatever. Street preacher, right? Then there's some people that are, nicer than that. And they say, no, we just preach the gospel and we just let the chips fall where they may. Well, Paul certainly preaching seems to agree with that here. It says, but there's something different going on. It says, at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet, and he was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking. So there's Paul. He's speaking the word, or he's teaching about Christianity. But he stops and look. Paul, looking intently at the man, seeing he had faith to be made well, says in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. And the man sprang up and began walking. See, there's something that accompanies the word of the gospel, and it's the action of the gospel. Paul's preaching, he's teaching, and he just stops. He sees somebody hurting, and he steps in to help. He sees somebody that needs something, and he steps in to provide it. He's helping the hurting versus slamming sinners. He didn't look at the man and ask if he qualified for a program. He didn't look at the man and take his theological temperature. He didn't look at the man and ask him if he was addicted to some kind of substance. He didn't look at the man and ask him about his sexual history and his sexual past. He just saw somebody hurting, and then he helped. That's what he did. That's what Jesus did, right? His ministry is flowing right out of Jesus. Did Jesus preach and teach? Absolutely. The Bible says he went to every village, city, synagogue, in the temple, teaching and preaching. What else did Jesus do? Is that all he did? Of course not. He went to every village and community, and he touched people. He healed people. He helped people who were hurting. In fact, the Gospels tell us the number one emotion that Jesus had toward people, toward the world, was compassion. Compassion. It was mercy. See, that's who we want to be as people. That's who we want to be as a church. That's why I think as a church we've kind of been on a real front edge of that. That's why we have like our community groups involved in their neighborhoods. That's why we do Mission St. Louis. It allows us to minister to people, do literacy training and job training to people who don't have any opportunity for that otherwise. That's why we have a counseling center here called Charis House, so that and 40% of our clients there live below the poverty line, because we want to offer gospel-centered, grace-based counseling to people who otherwise couldn't get it, couldn't afford it. That's why we partner with Urban K-Life. They have missionaries in 4 major urban high schools in our city, and we want to help them have a missionary in every school in this city. That's why we do the Covering House, which is, you might not know, but St. Louis is a hub for the sex trafficking of young women in the United States, and we want to see that stop. Like, we want to see that ended. We want to see God rescue women and restore and redeem them from that trade, from those places. We want our posture to be helping those who are hurting, rather than just slamming on people who look like they're sinning. And that's really, I mean, this is what Jesus said, Matthew 5:16. Remember, he said, "Let your light so shine before men, so that they will" what? Hear your good arguments. See your good Facebook posts. No, so that they will see your good works and what? And then glorify your Father in heaven. Blaise Pascal lived hundreds of years ago. He said about evangelism, he said, listen, we need to make good people wish Christianity was true, and then we'll show them that it is true. In other words, when you're in a post-Christian culture or a pre-Christian culture, people have to begin to want to believe something is true before they're going to be able to actually believe it's true. In other words, people need to be able to follow not just our logic, but our lives. They need to be able to follow not just our logic, but our lives. And the question this raises is my life, is your life causing people to pause in such a way that they would, I need to consider the claims of Christ here? Like, is my life doing that? What is your posture? Is it slamming, or is it generally helping and serving? That's what Paul's kind of first thing is, and he's helping, right? He does this amazing healing. Like, it's a miracle that happens, right? This guy who's crippled gets healed. Now, how do you think this, like, total pre-Christian culture, how do you think they're going to respond to that? They don't know anything about Jesus, right? They know, like, their gods. They know Zeus and Hermes. In fact, there was a legend in their community, this community of Lystra, that a couple hundred years ago, these 2 Roman Greek gods, Zeus and Hermes, chief of the gods and speaker of the gods, appeared in that city and as disguised as men, and no one recognized them. So when they see this miracle, this is what they think is going on. And look at verse 11 to 13. So this is where it kind of gets crazy and interesting. He says, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, so they saw the miracle, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, their local dialect, so they don't really understand what's being said here. They say, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. And Barnabas they called Zeus, Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, who had a temple at the entrance to the city, he brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. You might from the beginning kind of think, like, if you're Paul and Barnabas, they're like, you're the gods have come, we're going to do anything for you. Like, I could work with this, right? Like, we could find some common ground here. But that's not really how Paul approaches it. The second thing after helping the hurting is really building bridges rather than building barriers. So what is it like to build bridges rather than barriers in a place like this? So here's the deal. They're about to come out and offer pagan sacrifices, right? Paul had grown up as like a pure, clean, Jew. Can you imagine anything like more horrendous to him that they're going to come out and do pagan sacrifices there in front of him? Can you imagine anything to him that would have felt more dirty, more immoral? Like they're going to, all 10 commandments, they're going to break all 10 of them right now. Like they're just, boom, it's all over, right? So if you're Paul, like how are you going to respond to that? You're going to start building barriers and, oh, you guys are too evil, wicked, dirty. I can't be around you, and just retreat over here to my Christian subculture. But you could do that, or he could have been, you go into culture warrior mode, right? And like just go after them right there. Instead, he does something different. See, I think a lot of times, many Christians believe that it is our job to convict people of sin. We believe it is our job to make people feel guilty and shamed and all that kind of stuff. We believe it's our job to bring about conviction of the Spirit. It's not our job. You read the Bible, it's not our job to convict people of sin. It is the Holy Spirit's job. And he is darn good at it. He can do it. Yes, he's going to use you. He's going to use you. But what Paul is showing us is don't build barriers to the gospel. Build bridges to the gospel. And you can say, well, okay, is the pastor's kind of going soft here? And listen, don't hear what I'm not saying. It doesn't mean we never say anything, any hard truths. It doesn't mean we never talk about God's judgment. It doesn't mean we pretend that any and all actions and lifestyles are completely okay with God. But why do so many Christians look out at some people in the world who don't, disconnected from Christ, they don't know God, and then we expect them to act as if they do know God? And that just gets the gospel all backwards and screwy and makes this jankety gospel that says you out there are wicked and you get clean and you get your stuff together and you start living right and doing right, and then you can come be a part of us. The gospel, that's a jankety old gospel. The gospel says, no, Jesus came to get into people's lives who were, wicked and immoral and didn't know him and disconnected and hurting and broken. Jesus came to get involved with exactly those kinds of people. Not clean it up and Jesus will come in, as Jesus comes in and will make all things new. Will restore and transform you. Like, that's the difference. And so Paul starts, instead of building barriers, he's building bridges. And yes, it includes helping the hurting and doing like acts of deeds of service and mercy. But it's not just that. It does include the words we speak and the way we talk. And this is what we really see Paul do in 14 to 16. He continues to build a bridge in the way he talks. So this is his sermon to the pagans, verses 14 to 16. So when Paul and Barnabas heard of it, that they were going to offer the sacrifice, they didn't say this works for us. They tore their garments and they rushed out into the crowd crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men. We're like nature with you." In other words, we're just like you. But we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Now, how does Paul speak to them there? This is where it's important to really pay attention, because we see it here in 14. We'll see it again in chapter 17 when he's in Athens. This is a completely different sermon than he preached in chapter 13. So if you have one of these ESV Bibles, if you're not on your phone or whatever, you look at the left-hand page, and that chapter 13, that's his sermon to the religious Jews, people who were familiar at some level with the story. And notice how different it is from chapter 14, the sermon I just read you, to the non-Christian culture. See, you look here, number 1, chapter 13, that sermon's a lot longer, right? His sermon to the pagans is a lot shorter. You also see all these little verses set aside, like these quotations set aside in chapter 13, right? Why? Because when he's speaking to the Jewish religious people, he's preaching and arguing from the Scriptures. When he speaks to the pagans, he doesn't argue from the Scriptures. He doesn't preach from the Scriptures. Doesn't mean it's not biblical truth, but here, the difference is the Jews knew the Scriptures, so he reasoned from the Scripture. These pagans knew the world, they knew creation, so he reasoned from what God has done in creation, what God has done in the world. Paul, here, he doesn't use harsh terminology, categories like sin they don't understand. He speaks their language. He's building a bridge. Tim Keller, who's a pastor in New York City, said it like this. Here's the transition. In chapter 13, to the religious people, he preached, "You are sinners in need of a new kind of forgiveness." To these pagan people who don't understand the story at all, he's preached, "You are enslaved to idolatry and you need a new master. You need a new and better master. You need to know who this Jesus is." That's the sermon. Now listen, we can look at that and say, all these superstitious ancient people, right, with their idolatry, and they're making their idols and worshiping these mythical gods and making their sacrifice. These are just ancient superstitious people. Listen, we just do it in a different way. See, they had idols of the hands, right? The stuff they made and worship. We have idols of the heart. They had idols of the hand. We have idols of the heart, things that we desire and love and long for and seek after and live for. You can look at them and go, "Oh, they were going to bring oxen out and sacrifice animals, so ancient, so superstitious, so whatever." Listen, we just do it in a different way. See, if your God, if what you worship, and you can say, "Well, I don't worship, I'm not a religious person." Everybody worships because everybody is living for something, giving themselves to something, sacrificing for something. So see, if you're living for your career, your job, achievement, whatever, if you're living for that thing, and then one of your coworkers kind of gets in your way of achieving it, what would you do? If that's your God, you'll put her right on the altar, sacrifice her. Some of you have been put on an altar like that before. Some of you have done it to other people. See, if your goal is to have success and and career and status and achievement, and your family stands in the way of that, they just take too much time and effort, well, you'll put them right on the altar, right? And neglect them. See, they had idols of the hands. We have idols of the heart. And wherever we look, what we see is people were made to worship. We see people are worship. People are living for something. It doesn't matter if you're religious or not. So Paul's building that bridge. Hey, you're worshiping something. You're living for something. Let's talk about that. And, we can see it everywhere we look in our culture, too. People are living for something. What is it that they're living for? And Paul says those are vain things. Turn from the dead things to the living God. So let me just give you a couple examples. One is from Chariots of Fire. And usually we quote Chariots of Fire, right? We quote Eric Liddell, like, why do you run? I run because I feel God's pleasure. But what about the guy that competed with him was named Harold Abrams? And they asked him, why do you run the 100-meter race? And he said, I have 10 seconds to justify my existence. That's worship. Like, if I can't get that, then I'm going to die. Like, that's the only thing that makes my life worth living. Let's go to Rocky. Great movies, right? I love the Rocky movies, and it kind of dates me, but depending on which one you watch or whatever, but all like the first 5, Adrian is whining to Rocky about, like, why do you always have to fight? Why do you got to get back in the ring? Why do you got to fight? I don't understand. She's always whining, and so one of them, Rocky answers and says, like, why do you have to fight? And he says, because that's the only way that I'll know I'm not a bum. In other words, if I don't have that, I'm a failure. I'm a complete loser. I'm just a bum. That's worship. That's living for something, right? And then one more, we'll take Madonna, who has been one of the great, artists and musicians and performers across multiple generations, right? Very talented person. And she said this: every time I accomplish something, I feel like a special human being. But after a little while, I'll feel mediocre and uninteresting again. See, idolatry is like an addiction. It provides these highs at first, right? But then you start to kind of need more and more and more because the high goes down. So she says, I have to get myself past this again and again and again. My drive is from the horrible fear of being mediocre. I have to prove that I am somebody. I have to have it. That is worship. That's what Paul's idolatry. And he's saying, listen, we all do it. I can show you the God who provides not just those gifts that you seek, but provides himself as well. So this is where he builds the bridge to creation. Verse 17. He says, God did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven, fruitful seasons, satisfying your heart with food and with gladness. You see what he's saying? Listen, even though you're a community who's never acknowledged God, never known him, you've been walking away from him, what has been God's response to you? He's given you good gifts. He's given you good things. Even though you haven't known him, he's given you food and abundance and rain and all these kinds of things. And then here's what he's saying. He's saying that if you have ever experienced anything good in your life, if you've ever experienced joy or happiness or relationship that was fulfilling or interesting, if you've ever had a good meal or a good drink, if you went outside in the sun yesterday and just enjoyed being outside, enjoyed the sunshine, if you've ever had anything good happen to you in your life, that was a gift of God. And he's saying to these people who have never acknowledged God at all, even though you've never acknowledged, you've been rebelling against him, rejecting him, God's given you good and gracious things. See, some of you are in that kind of state. Maybe you walked with God, were connected to him earlier in life or as a kid or something like that, but you've been walking away from him. You're rebelling against him, rejecting him. And here's what he's saying. If you've ever experienced anything good in your life, it was from God. And if he is that good to those who are rejecting him, imagine how good he is to those who receive him. If he's that good to those who are rejecting him, imagine how good he is to those who actually receive him. So Paul is saying, listen, don't give your life to you're worshiping all these gods. They're not real. You're worshiping beauty. You're worshiping art. You're worshiping sex, romance, job, career, success, whatever. Don't give your life to sex, romance, relationships, career. Those are all good things. You can give yourself to the God who created all those things, who created money and work and sex and relationships. You can know not just the gift, but you can know the giver. If he's that good to those who reject him, how amazing is he to those who actually receive him? So we know that, like the gift, idolatry is putting the gifts of God in the place of God, right? That's what it is. And you probably know this from relationships. Like I know, my wife is a really good gift giver. Like my birthday's coming up in a month or so, and she'll give me some really good gifts. And I'm a terrible gift giver. Like I don't know how to do it. I always get it wrong. Apparently, women don't want vacuum cleaners for Valentine's Day. I don't know. No, I've never actually done that. I'm dumb, but not that dumb. So I apologize to anybody who has done that. You're at the bottom of the totem pole. No, but I don't know how to buy a gift. I don't know how to wrap a gift. Can't do anything. But my wife gives really thoughtful gifts. And so, imagine if my birthday, she gives me these 2 great gifts. I'm like, thank you, honey. These are the greatest gifts you've ever given me. These are amazing. She's like, good. I'm glad you like them because I'm leaving you and I'm gonna be gone. I'm like, wait, what? Well, you got my gifts, right? That's gonna work. I'll send you a birthday present or Christmas present from time to time. No, the gifts are just symbols and tokens of who you are. If I can't have you, who cares about the gifts? The gifts are awesome, and I enjoy every minute of them, but only if I have you to enjoy them with. That's what idolatry distorts about God. It's like his gifts are amazing, and we enjoy them all the time. But Paul's saying, listen, in Christ you can have not just the gifts, but you can have the giver of gifts. And it's the opposite. They believe, to get those, we have to sacrifice to get God. And no, we serve the God who sacrificed to get us. That's how Jesus works. So that's how Paul builds the bridge. So he's helping the hurting. He's building the bridges instead of barriers. And the last thing he does, which is probably the most amazing, is he anticipates antagonism that's going to come. He endures the hardship that's going to come with this gospel. Why? See, whenever the gospel comes into a person's life, into your heart, whenever the gospel comes into a community or a culture, it always brings both acceptance and opposition. There's always a clash. I mean, we've seen it all the way through the book of Acts, right? Every time it comes, there's some kind of fight, some kind of battle, some kind of issue. Because whenever there's idolatry, eventually those things, like a drug, they wear off, and you experience anger, pain, frustration, and disappointment. And so it brings this stuff up. Idolatry will just bring that, and when the gospel comes, it clashes because the gospel messes with our idols. And Paul's about to find out from this crowd who's about to unleash on him that when you mess with people's idols, people kind of get crazy. Now, I found this out firsthand many years ago, actually. I used to work for Bank of America, and when you're a banker, you're messing with people's money, right? And for some people, that's their idol. You start messing with people's gods, people get crazy. You want to hear some great stories, you want to see people act the fool, then just hang out in a bank or go work in a bank sometime. I can tell you about 100 stories. I had my life threatened. I had my wife's life threatened. I had my unborn children's life threatened. I was offered bribes. I had one guy who literally, luckily the banking, the lobby was locked up and closed, and only the drive-thru was open. He was so angry, he got out of his car, got in my face in the window, and was just beating on the glass like this. He looked like the Hulk with his veins popping everywhere, and it was a good thing the lobby's closed. Otherwise, it it would have been MMA death match in there. Otherwise, this guy was, he was worked up. So you start messing with people's idols, and it stirs people, and this is what happens to Paul. So verse 19, amazing miracle. He preaches the sermon, and then it says, Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and persuaded the crowds. So they incite a riot, and it says this: they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing he was dead. They pelted him with rocks until they thought that he had died. See, they become part of this mob mentality. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, you mess with my idols, and everybody turns on them, and they're shouting stuff in other languages, and they can't understand what's going on, and all of a sudden they're picking up stones. I don't know how Barnabas got out of it, but somehow he did. But anyway, that's what happened. And I don't know if you've ever been involved, or if you've ever been a part of a mob scene or something turn like that in a crowd. I don't know if you've ever been a part of that. I was again, many years ago, but I was doing mission work with a team in a different country, different culture, and, they always tell you, do not go out at night. It's dangerous. Do not go out at night. And so what do my buddy and I do? We go out at night. We got to go see what's going on because, here's a place you've never been, don't know, don't understand anything, but go on out at midnight. It's a good time to be doing something like that. So good idea, but when you're young, you're stupid. And so I did, and maybe you weren't, so I don't offend anybody. You might be young and really smart. I was young and stupid and probably continue to be today. But we went out, and there was a big crowd gathered, and we got part of the crowd. We're like, what are they looking at? We get in there, and there was some crazy stuff going on, and we're kind of we're part of the crowd. And then all of a sudden, people started to recognize we weren't part of their crowd. We didn't look like them and dress like them, and all of a sudden people are turning toward us, and we're the spectacle. And we're looking around, and all of a sudden people are angry. People are starting to shout stuff. They're cutting off our lines of retreat behind us, and we're trying to back out, but your adrenaline starts pumping, your language skills aren't working anymore, and so there's people shouting, and I never got the official interpretation of what was being said, but it amounted to kill the Americans. It wasn't good, and we were just in this crowd. Man, it just occurred to me there's a pattern in my life of people wanting to do harm to me physically. This could be a problem. And so now I don't even know what point I was making, but we were in a melee like that, and I'm notorious for starting sermons, my ADD, and then starting stories and sermons, then I don't finish it. So, spoiler alert, we made it. I lived. My buddy, he didn't. No, he did. I'm just kidding. It started to turn sad right quickly, right? No, he made it. We both did somehow miraculously. I don't even know how they chased us for a long time, but, even a slow white boy like me can move when you need to. So we did it. Anyway, so we escaped, but Paul falls in the clutch of this crowd. He doesn't escape, and they form up, and they pelt him with rocks, and they think he's dead. And the question I would ask is how did they go from you're the gods, we're going to praise you and honor you? How did they go from praise to punishment? How did they go from adulation to anger? It's almost the same as Jesus' story, right, that we just recounted a couple weeks ago, that Jesus comes into Jerusalem on a Sunday with palm branches and Hosanna, the King is here, and on Friday they're saying, crucify him. And Paul is finding, as he spreads the gospel, that his life is becoming shaped and formed very much like Jesus' life was. And so he finds himself in the situation where he is stoned. And the question is, what made the crowd turn like that? And here's why I think it is because suddenly they realized that they were not going to get their way. They were not going to get their agenda. He was going to be a miracle worker, great, we'll sacrifice, do whatever. They were used to worshiping gods that were like vending machines. You put in the coins and you dispense out the blessing. They viewed God as a device to get what you want. And Paul comes and preaches the gospel and says, no, God is glorious and powerful and sovereign. He can't be bribed or manipulated in any way. And so the question this really raises, and it's a hard question, it's a question I've been kind of wrestling with myself the last several months, which is, am I in love with God, or am I in love with my agenda for God? Am I in love really with God, or am I just in love with what I think He can do for me, or what my agenda for my life or my thing is? It's kind of a question for any relationship, really, but especially for our relationship with God. It's am I in love with God, or just my agenda for Him? Is God to me just a device where I get what I want, or is He the chief desire by which all things come down? That's the question. That's why they turned, and that's why they pelted Paul. But yet Paul anticipates this kind of stuff. He doesn't seem surprised. He saw it in Jesus' life. He sees it in him. He gets stoned, but he doesn't go on CNN and complain about his lack of rights and how everybody's, against him and things like that. He bears it. He endures it as a servant of the cross. Imagine, don't we all hate criticism? Don't we all hate getting a bad review, or our boss doesn't like us, or we get an email or whatever? We hate criticism. Paul preaches this first sermon here. He didn't just get an email of criticism. He gets stoned. That's crazy, and yet he has the confidence of God. He has the tenacity of God. And here's what it says he did. Verse 20. When the disciples gathered about him, they thought he was dead. He rose up, entered the city, and on the next day, he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. Stoned on one day, thought he was dead. The next day, Derbe is 60 miles away. He goes on a 60-mile hike the next day. Like, go St. Louis marathons right now. It's 26.2 miles going on right now. So that's more than 2 marathons that he does the day after he gets stoned. A lot of us have seen, Mike Matheny, when he was playing baseball, take that fastball to the face, spit out some teeth, and then be ready to go again. Paul took a lot of fastballs to the face here with these rocks, and he got up, and the next day walked 60 miles. And then it says this, and this is the part that just really blew me up and totally undid me. Verse 21. When they preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra. Lystra was where he just got stoned. Like, they returned to Lystra. I'm like, Paul, are you a flipping moron? Like, why would you go back to this place they just stoned you at? It's because he served and followed the God, Jesus, who got pelted, who was assaulted on the cross, and yet who continues to come back again and again, continues to pursue you and me with his relentless, never giving up, never failing, always powerful grace. He continues to pursue. That's the God Paul pursued. In fact, the irony of this passage is to say, look, the gods have come down to us like men. And Paul says, yes, but the gospel says God has come down as a man, Jesus. But we think, if the gods came down, they would want sacrifice. They would want us to give, and they would want to receive and take a sacrifice from us. Our God came down not to take a sacrifice, but to make it. In fact, Jesus came to be it. He bears the ultimate cost, so we can bear the minor cost of our posture towards the world and whatever that costs. See, what's your posture toward the world? Those who don't look like you, think like you, vote like you, smell like you. Are you helping the hurting? Are you building bridges? Are you anticipating there's going to be antagonism? Are you showing the world that you're in love with God himself, not just an agenda for God? See, if we want to see the gospel come to those who don't know him, those who are disconnected, those who are far from God, am I prepared to pay the cost? We can bear these minor costs because Jesus is born the ultimate one. Let's pray together. Jesus, we love you and we thank you that you come, you are a truer and better master. Lord, all these things that we set our hearts and our minds and our affections on, Lord, they're good things. They are good gifts, but they are not you. And so, Lord, help us to repent, to turn from these vain things to the living God. Lord, help us to be a church that has a posture toward the world that is not mean-spirited, but that is loving, helping, serving, compassionate, merciful, that offers hope in Christ. In whose name we pray. Amen.